When Sancho Panza found himself lying flat on the ground with Don Quixote's exhausted body sprawled across his legs, he could hardly decide whether the pain in his bones or the disappointment in his heart was greater. His brief moment of hope, the spark that had carried him through the chaos of flying through the air like a sack thrown by giants, vanished instantly when he realized Don Quixote had mistaken the windmills once again for monstrous enemies. He groaned as he tried to free himself, mumbling prayers and curses in equal measure. Don Quixote, dazed but determined, pushed himself up painfully, dusted off the broken pieces of his armor, and announced that such setbacks were the natural trials faced by noble knights on sacred quests. Sancho stared at him, bewildered, wondering how much longer he could endure these noble quests before his ribs simply cracked under the strain. Once Don Quixote regained his footing, he declared that no true knight was ever defeated by mere enchantments, insisting that the sorcerer Freston, his imagined eternal enemy, had transformed the giants into windmills at the last moment to rob him of his great victory. Sancho wanted to protest, to explain for the 100th time that the towering structures were nothing but windmills designed to grind grain. But he had traveled with his master long enough to know reason was wasted breath. So instead he nodded weakly and rubbed his bruised shoulder. The pair retrieved what remained of their equipment, gathered their scattered belongings, and set off slowly along the dusty road. Don Quixote limped ahead with unwavering pride, refusing to admit the pain that showed plainly in every stiff step. Sancho followed, shaking his head and silently calculating how many beatings, falls, and humiliations he still had to survive before receiving the island he had been promised. As they continued their journey, the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the hills. Sancho was still nursing his aches when Don Quixote suddenly stopped and raised a hand, signaling for silence. He had heard distant voices, young voices, piercing the still morning air. Sancho listened closely and made out what seemed to be cries and pleas. They hurried toward the sound. When they reached a clearing, they saw a scene that stirred even Sancho's battered heart. A boy, hardly more than 9 or 10, tied to an oak tree while a stern farmer held a thick cord, preparing to deliver another savage blow. The boy sobbed and begged for mercy, insisting he had done no wrong. Don Quixote's eyes blazed with righteous fury. Finally, here was a moment worthy of a knight's intervention. He fixed his helmet and charged forward with the authority of a king's champion. "Unhand that child!" Don Quixote thundered, pointing his spear at the startled farmer. The man froze mid-strike, taken aback by the sudden appearance of a knight in battered armor and a squire who looked like he had recently fallen out of the sky. Don Quixote demanded to know why the boy was being punished so cruelly. The farmer, trembling slightly, explained that the child was his servant, tasked with tending sheep, and that he had been careless, losing several animals. The boy immediately protested, insisting that he had not lost any sheep at all, but that the farmer simply refused to pay him his wages. Don Quixote turned his stern gaze toward the boy, who nodded vigorously, tears streaming down his face. The knight's heart burned with indignation. He raised his chin, declaring that justice would be served that very moment. He ordered the farmer to release the boy instantly and to pay him every coin owed. The farmer, cornered by Don Quixote's unwavering stance and the intimidating point of his spear, reluctantly untied the boy. But instead of paying him, the man attempted to explain that they were near his farm and that he would settle everything once they arrived. The boy shook his head in terror, insisting that the farmer would beat him more fiercely once the knight left. Don Quixote reassured the child with great confidence, claiming that no man alive would dare break a promise made in the presence of a knight-errant. He warned the farmer that failure to compensate the boy would invite divine punishment and the wrath of knightly justice. The farmer bowed his head, outwardly humble. Seeing this, Don Quixote felt satisfied. He sheathed his spear and declared the matter resolved, certain that he had just restored balance to the world. The boy wiped his tears, still unconvinced but too afraid to contradict the knight. Satisfied with his act of justice, Don Quixote mounted his horse with as much dignity as a wounded man could manage. As he and Sancho resumed their journey, he praised himself for rescuing the helpless and correcting the wicked, comparing his deed to those performed by the legendary knights of old. Sancho, still uneasy, glanced back several times, worried about leaving the boy alone with the farmer. But Don Quixote insisted the matter was settled, for no man would dare dishonor a knight's command. Sancho wanted to believe him, but every instinct told him otherwise. Despite his doubts, he said nothing. Don Quixote continued delivering grand speeches about chivalry, honor, and the sacred duty to defend the weak. Sancho listened half-heartedly, wondering how a man who could be so noble in spirit could also be so catastrophically blind. Barely had they disappeared down the road when the farmer seized the boy again, dragging him back to the tree with grim satisfaction. "Now, Andres," he growled, "I'll teach you not to complain to wandering fools." The boy screamed and begged, but the man tied him tighter than before. With each strike of the cord, Andres cried Don Quixote's name, hoping the knight might return. But the only answer was the rustling of leaves and the harsh breath of his master. The farmer beat him until the boy's pleas faded into exhausted whimpers. When he finally released him, he warned that if Andres ever mentioned wages again, he would receive even worse. The boy staggered away, bruised and trembling. Don Quixote's noble intentions had only brought him greater suffering. Yet the knight, oblivious to the painful truth, rode on proudly, believing he had saved the child from injustice. As the day grew hotter, Sancho's worries multiplied. He wondered aloud whether they might return to check on the boy. Don Quixote, confident as ever, dismissed the idea, saying Andres was surely enjoying the wealth that rightfully belonged to him. His mind drifted instead to new fantasies of glory. The road stretched before them like a ribbon across the rolling plains, and Don Quixote saw in every distant hill the possibility of adventure. Sancho tried to change the subject by asking once again about the promised island he hoped to govern someday. Don Quixote assured him that such rewards would come soon, as the world was full of opportunities for brave souls who sought honor. Sancho nodded, though he had begun to suspect that islands rarely came to men who followed knights who mistook windmills for giants. Still, he stayed loyal, partially because he believed in Don Quixote's kindness, and partially because he had nowhere else to go. By late afternoon, Don Quixote's energy returned, and he became restless, searching for another wrong to right. He spoke grandly of creating a new golden age, one where knights restored justice, defended widows, and eradicated evil. Sancho listened, torn between admiration and exasperation. Don Quixote's imagination soared higher with each word, building dazzling visions that bore little resemblance to reality. Yet Sancho could not help but be moved at times by the conviction in his master's voice. They traveled through patches of forest and open meadows, encountering farmers, shepherds, and travelers who stared in confusion at the knight in battered armor. Don Quixote took each curious glance as a sign of respect, convinced his legend was beginning to spread. Sancho merely sighed and adjusted his saddle. The road felt endless, but he continued walking, trying not to think about how many more falls, bruises, and heartbreaks awaited him. Evening finally approached, casting an orange glow across the countryside. Don Quixote decided they would stop and rest beneath a cluster of trees near a quiet stream. As they settled, he reflected proudly on the day's deeds, especially the rescue of young Andres. Sancho, unable to hold his worry any longer, gently suggested that perhaps they should have stayed longer to ensure the boy's safety. Don Quixote scoffed, insisting that a knight's word carried the force of divine law. Besides, he said, the farmer had shown clear signs of repentance. Sancho said nothing more. He lay back and stared at the darkening sky, haunted by the boy's cries. Don Quixote, meanwhile, drifted into dreams of future battles, noble quests, and everlasting fame. The world around them grew quiet, but the echoes of their choices followed silently behind, waiting for the dawn and the next chapter of their journey.